Please subscribe to the channel to watch the latest videos.
Ukraine supporters need to rethink their theory of victory. Our experience since the foundation of the Republic, wrote journalist Walter Lippmann in 1943, has shown that domestic division over foreign relations is the outward and visible consequence, and not the cause, of an insolvent foreign policy. By insolvent, Lippmann meant a foreign policy with strategic ends beyond its military and diplomatic means. His argument resonates today as House Republicans resist the White House's request for a new aid package for Ukraine. Prevailing opinion in Washington holds that GOP recalcitrance is causing problems in the United States-Ukraine strategy. But it's at least in equal measure the consequence of them. Those problems were laid bare this past week in bracing remarks by Valery Zaluzhny, Ukraine's top general, in an interview with The Economist. He pronounced that Ukraine's counteroffensive, in which the West had invested great hopes and billions of dollars in armaments, was unlikely to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Just like in the First World War, we have reached the level of technology that puts us into a stalemate. This was foreseeable. A year ago, when Ukraine had the momentum, having routed the Russians in Kharkiv and Kherson, General Mark A. Milley, then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, suggested a negotiated settlement to the war. Like Zaluzhny, he made an explicit comparison to World War I, noting that early on in that war it became clear that it was not winnable anymore, militarily. It's quite possible that negotiations were at that point infeasible, that the Russians would have refused any talks, and that the Ukrainians could not have been dissuaded from making a decisive push to retake more of their occupied territory. But at least in public, the Biden administration made no effort to try. After Milley's exploratory statements were roundly dismissed, the White House committed to backing Ukraine's counteroffensive as long as it takes. As Zaluzhny diplomatically pointed out, the U.S. administration didn't always act decisively. Long-range missiles and tanks were most relevant to us last year, but they only arrived this year, he told The Economist, which made it easier for the Russians to retrench. Whether this was because of bureaucratic inertia, or President Biden's effort to manage escalation risk, the result is the same. Ukraine today finds itself worse off than it was last November. Its troops are exhausted and depleted, its weapon stocks are running low, and Western publics are more polarized over providing further support. Republican members of Congress who have voted no on Ukraine aid bills, their growing ranks now include House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican, Louisiana, are widely maligned among Washington's foreign policy elite. At worst, they are cast as authoritarians who want Russian President Vladimir Putin to win. At best, they are isolationists who don't understand the United States' historic role in the world. Some Republicans skeptical of Ukraine aid surely fall into these categories. But others have well-grounded concerns about the viability of the U.S. strategy. Aid votes are one of Congress's few points of leverage over an administration's foreign policy. A recent letter to the Biden administration from a group of House Republicans insists that before Congress approves more funding, we should understand the end-state goal and exit criteria, hardly an impertinent request. Ukraine's counteroffensive was supposed to sustain political support for Kyiv by proving that it could reconquer lost territory. Now, supporters of Ukraine might need to make the inverse argument: Ukraine is not reconquering substantial territory, and aid is needed indefinitely to forestall a devastating defeat. The window for a negotiated settlement favorable to Ukraine, if there ever was one, has surely closed, as Russia sees a technologically stalemated battlefield in which it has a long-term advantage in manpower. Ukraine now needs to outlast the Russians. Putin is not immortal, and authoritarian power transitions can be bumpy. The United States should never recognize Putin's illicit conquests. But it might need to pivot from dreaming of victory to preparing to live with stalemate. The stalemate in World War I was broken by U.S. entry as a direct combatant against Germany. But there is virtually no appetite in the United States for direct war with Russia. Russian victory in Ukraine would be a terrible blow to U.S. interests, but not terrible enough to risk nuclear war. The foreign policy establishment's ambitions for a defeated Russia, contrasted with the attritional slog on the ground that has developed instead, reflect classic strategic insolvency. If the administration articulated an achievable endgame and the plan to attain it, congressional resistance to Ukraine aid might stop growing. Most in Congress see Russia as an American adversary and understand the importance of an independent Ukraine. It should be possible to rally congressional majorities around that shared vision. But as the counteroffensive winds down, Ukraine's supporters will need to rethink their political approach. It won't work anymore to simply deride or condescend to skeptics. They aren't the problem, the strategy is. Perhaps the push and pull in Congress can help forge a more durable one. There's a way for the U.S. to compete with China, and to work with China. Janet L. Yellen is the Treasury Secretary. President Biden and I have been clear-eyed about navigating the complexities of the U.S.-China relationship with a pragmatic economic strategy, one that protects our vital national security interests while seeking a stable and healthy economic relationship. In July, I traveled to Beijing to pursue this approach with China's new economic team. We've made significant strides in deepening senior-level contact since then. This week, I'll host my Chinese counterpart, Vice Premier He Lifeng, in San Francisco, as we engage in more intensive diplomacy designed to further stabilize the relationship and make progress on key issues. Here are the principles behind our approach. As a foundation, our two nations have an obligation to establish resilient lines of open communication and to prevent our disagreements from spiraling into conflict. But we also know that our relationship cannot be circumscribed to crisis management. Together, the United States and China represent 40% of the global economy. A constructive economic relationship can not only serve as a stabilizing force for the overall relationship but also benefit workers and families in both countries and beyond. America's economic strategy is centered on lifting our economic potential at home, not on suppressing other economies. That's why President Biden has enacted historic legislation that invests in infrastructure and the key industries of the future. We recognize that economics is not a zero-sum game, and we seek healthy economic competition with China that can benefit both countries over time. But healthy competition requires a rules-based, level playing field. This week, I will speak to my counterpart about our serious concerns with Beijing's unfair economic practices, including its large-scale use of non-market tools, its barriers to market access, and its coercive actions against U.S. firms in China. In certain sectors, these unfair practices have resulted in the overconcentration of the production of critical goods inside China. The United States, along with our allies and partners, has been taking well-calibrated steps to mitigate this concentration by diversifying our critical supply chains. Our goal is not to trigger a disorderly, wholesale private sector pullback from China. As I said in Beijing in July, there is an important distinction between diversifying our supply chains and decoupling our economies. Diverse supply chains are necessary in a volatile world. Decoupling our economies would be economically disastrous and run counter to our national interests. In all U.S. foreign relations, our administration's first strategic priority is to protect our national security and that of our allies. This is an area where we do not compromise. We continue to take targeted actions to secure our vital security interests, including through our announcement of an outbound investment regime this summer. As we take these actions, our policy is to clearly articulate their intent and design to other countries, including China, to reduce the risk of misunderstanding and miscalculation. During my trip to Beijing, I explained to my counterpart that our outbound investment program is tailored toward the specific national security objective of preventing the advancement of highly sensitive technologies that are critical to the next generation of military innovation and could be used to conduct activities that threaten the national security of the United States. This program, like all of our national security actions in the economic sphere, is predicated on straightforward national security considerations and not designed for us to gain a competitive economic advantage over any other country. We've recently deepened our discussions with China through the establishment of economic and financial working groups under Vice Premier He's direction and mine. The purpose of these groups is to provide ongoing channels for our teams to drill into the substance of economic and financial policy issues. We are not reconstituting the wide-ranging U.S.-China strategic and economic dialogue by another name but, rather, focusing on specific high-priority economic topics on which we can make tangible progress. These working groups met for the first time last month, and they will convene again this week. The groups enable us to exchange information on macroeconomic and financial developments about the world's two largest economies, which is particularly crucial today, given uncertainties in the global outlook and the economic headwinds facing China in its recovery. They also enable us to address some of the underlying sources of bilateral tension in the economic relationship. And they provide an opportunity to advance cooperation on common challenges, from reducing illicit financial flows that support terrorism and the illegal drug trade to tackling the existential threat of climate change. We have shown that we can make progress on global challenges together. For example, prior moments of bilateral cooperation have made climate breakthroughs such as the Paris Agreement possible. We now need to extend our cooperation toward one of today's key challenges, supporting developing countries by making essential investments to alleviate poverty, build resilience, and enable transitions to clean energy. Take debt. Today, more than half of all low-income countries are near or in debt distress, double the share of countries that were in this situation in 2015. Debt overhang erodes the economic foundations of these countries and serves as a drag on the global economy. Even as debt treatments are taking too long, the international community's extensive discussions with China and other official creditors enabled Zambia to formalize an agreement last month to restructure its unsustainable debt, allowing Zambia to restart its stalling economy. We want to build on this progress. As I prepare for my meeting with Vice Premier He, I proceed with confidence about the strength of our nation. The United States has experienced a rapid economic recovery from the pandemic, with an exceptionally strong labor market and easing inflation. And we are lifting our long-term economic outlook with major investments while reinvigorating our alliances and partnerships in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. We should not make the mistake of becoming so consumed with our competition with China that we become defined by it. We would do well to remember that America's economic preeminence emanates from within, our people, our inventive spirit, and our democratic values and institutions. As long as we invest in and commit to these strengths, we have no reason to fear healthy economic competition with any other country. Elite colleges failed to fight anti-Semitism. But these academics did. There is no shortage of appalling moral cowardice or intellectual confusion about anti-Semitism and Israel on college campuses. Some college presidents have refused to take an unequivocal stance, condemning the slaughter of Israeli civilians on October 7. Others have failed to address intimidation, hate speech, threats, and other illegal actions against Jewish students. And, worst of all, some faculty members at certain elite schools have openly discriminated against students or signed on to screeds blaming Israeli victims for the massacre, asking to recontextualize the pogrom as a military exercise and echoing calls to eliminate Israel entirely. Only under extreme pressure have 3 Ivy League presidents belatedly promised to address anti-Semitism. At Cooper Union in Manhattan last month, protesters swarming at the entrance to the school's downtown building gained entrance despite the guards' best efforts, walked upstairs to the library, where Jewish students, some wearing yarmulkes, took refuge. Like something out of 1930s Europe, when guards barred the library, the protesters banged on the doors for at least 10 minutes while shouting. One Jewish student heard calls for the murder of Jews. The university took no action against the students, and its president misrepresented the action as peaceful. This goes way beyond displays of the Palestinian flag or slogans such as Free Palestine. Anti-Semitic incidents are up on college campuses by nearly 400%, including incidents of swastika graffiti, arson, assaults, physical intimidation, and property damage. Slogans such as From the River to the Sea are not simply calls for Palestinian independence. That particular phrase demands the elimination of all of Israel and its Jewish inhabitants, the stated goal of Hamas. In case anyone had doubts, we can do away with the notion that anti-Zionism is separable from anti-Semitism. If that were true, American Jews would not be in danger. The White House weighed in with a full-throated condemnation of events taking place on college campuses. Amid the rise in poisonous, anti-Semitic rhetoric and hate crimes that President Biden has fought against for years, there is an extremely disturbing pattern of anti-Semitic messaging being conveyed on college campuses, Andrew Bates, Deputy White House Press Secretary, said last week. Just over the past week, we've seen protests and statements on college campuses that call for the annihilation of the State of Israel, for genocide against the Jewish people. These grotesque sentiments and actions shock the conscience and turn the stomach. Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff, Deputy Education Secretary Cindy Martin and Deborah Lipstadt, Biden's special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, met with Jewish leaders to hear their concerns. The president has ordered his team to come up with policies to confront anti-Semitism and Islamophobia on campus. However, not all universities, college presidents, and faculty groups are cut from the same cloth. Credit is due for robust responses from hundreds of faculty members, alumni, donors, and academic officials around the country to both anti-Semitism and administrative paralysis. Scores of Harvard alumni signed a letter to their alma mater that included demands for meaningful action and blasted tolerance of Jew hatred. These horrific events were met with acclaim by over 30 Harvard student groups, who called the intentional slaughter of civilians justified and claimed that Israel was solely responsible. This diluted romanticization of violence has been matched by calls for more violence and the obliteration of the State of Israel by any means necessary. This, while Jewish students mourned the murder of their own family and friends, and the whole conscientious world reeled at the scale of the horror. And during this time, the university remained silent. In the absence of any official pronouncement to the contrary, these letters conveyed the implicit approval of a silent administration. It was incumbent on the administration to speak out swiftly against terrorism, especially when it has spoken clearly and forcefully on many recent geopolitical and political events. It is one thing to champion the rights of Palestinians and to vociferously express concern for the safety of civilians, particularly children, in Gaza, as many members of this alumni group have always done and will continue to do. It is quite another to trade in the crude language of resistance to justify the grotesque bullying and intimidation of Jewish students on campus and to exalt ideologies of violence and brutality that run counter to the idea of democracy itself. More than 450 Columbia faculty and staff members decried their university's response. We are horrified that anyone would celebrate these monstrous attacks or, as some members of the Columbia faculty have done in a recent letter, try to recontextualize them as a salvo, as the exercise of a right to resist occupation, or as military action. We are astonished that anyone at Columbia would try to legitimize an organization that shares none of the university's core values of democracy, human rights, or the rule of law. Any civilian loss of life during war is awful, but, as colleagues on the faculty acknowledged in the letter mentioned above, the law of war clearly distinguishes between tragic but incidental civilian death and suffering, on one hand, and the deliberate targeting of civilians, on the other. We feel sorrow for all civilians who are killed or suffering in this war, including so many in Gaza. Yet whatever one thinks of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or of Israeli policies, Hamas's genocidal massacre was an act of terror and cannot be justified, or its true purpose obscured with euphemisms and oblique references. We ask the entire university community to condemn the Hamas attack unambiguously. We doubt anyone would try to justify this sort of atrocity if it were directed against the residents of a nation other than Israel. Finally, the university cannot tolerate violence, speech that incites it, or hate speech. Just as we condemn any bigoted comments or acts directed at Palestinian and Muslim students, we are appalled by the spate of anti-Semitic incidents on campus since October 7. These incidents, which include anti-Semitic epithets, physical assault, and swastikas scrawled on bathroom walls, are growing in frequency and are creating a hostile and unsafe environment that impacts our entire community. At Cornell University, police were summoned and a student arrested for making grotesque anti-Semitic death threats. The school's president, Martha E. Pollack, vowed to combat anti-Jewish bigotry. We will not tolerate anti-Semitism at Cornell. Indeed, we will not tolerate hatred of any form, including racism or Islamophobia. It means, first and foremost, that when there are threats or incitement to violence, we will respond rapidly and forcefully, as we did in this case, Pollack wrote. She also promised new programming, speakers, policies, and dedicated entities to fight anti-Semitism. After ethnic studies departments at the University of California objected to a description of Hamas's October 7 attacks as terrorism and called on the UC administrative leadership to retract its charges of terrorism, to uplift the Palestinian freedom struggle, and to stand against Israel's war crimes against and ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinian people, school regent Jay Shores denounced the lack of empathy for Jewish life and the attempt to whitewash the worst slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. Tulane University took a more muscular approach after a protest turned violent. Everyone who committed an illegal act on this day will be held accountable for their actions. In addition, all students are accountable to the Code of Student Conduct, President Michael Fitz said. After several arrests were made, he vowed that additional arrests may be forthcoming as video evidence is reviewed. Likewise, Erwin Chemerinsky, dean of the UC Berkeley School of Law, wrote a passionate denunciation of anti-Semitic outbursts and the ensuing weak response from academic administrators. I was stunned when students across the country, including mine, immediately celebrated the Hamas terrorist attack in Israel on October 7. Students for Justice in Palestine called the terror attack a historic win for the Palestinian resistance. A Columbia professor called the Hamas massacre awesome and a stunning victory. A Yale professor tweeted, "It's been such an extraordinary day," while calling Israel a murderous, genocidal settler state. A Chicago art professor posted a note reading, "Israelis are pigs. Savages. Very, very bad people. Irredeemable excrement. May they all rot in hell." A UC Davis professor tweeted, "Zionist journalists have houses W addresses, kids in school," adding, "They can fear their bosses, but they should fear us more." There are, sadly, countless other examples. How can anyone celebrate the killing of 260 people attending a music festival, or the brutal massacre of more than 100 people in a kibbutz, or the pulling of people from their houses to take as hostages? If this happened to people who were not Jews, would there be such celebrations? I have heard few campus administrators speak out publicly about the anti-Semitism that has become prevalent this month. They want to seem neutral or not be perceived as Islamophobic. I understand. I, too, refrained from speaking out against those who defended Hamas' terrorist attack. But when do we stop being silent, and when do we say the anti-Semitism must be condemned and it is not acceptable on our campuses? I believe this must be that time. I have no idea how it would be determined who is rightly entitled to what land, but I do know that calling for the total elimination of Israel is anti-Semitic. There has been enough silence and enough tolerance of anti-Semitism on college campuses. I call on my fellow university administrators to speak out and denounce the celebrations of Hamas and the blatant anti-Semitism that is being voiced. Other groups of students, faculties, and alumni continue to challenge university officials. For example, at Stanford University, over 1,800 Stanford affiliates signed an open letter expressing disappointment in President Richard Saller and Provost Jenny Martinez's response to the October 7 Hamas attack on Israel over their failure to condemn Hamas actions. Emory University President Gregory Fenz condemned the Hamas attack while recognizing the plight of all civilians and condemned anti-Semitic rhetoric at a rally. Also, Emory put an assistant professor on leave for allegedly making anti-Semitic comments on a private social media account. This should not be difficult. One can unreservedly denounce the October 7 pogrom that slaughtered 1,400 people and mourn Palestinian lives lost in the ensuing war. One can seek to improve daily conditions for Palestinians, advocate for a two-state solution, criticize the Netanyahu government and defend free speech. Indeed, many Israelis already do. Millions of American Jews do, as well. What is not acceptable, however, is to remain silent in the face of despicable anti-Semitism or, worse, to aid and abet it. It is indefensible to cheer for the destruction of an entire country and its inhabitants. Denigration of Jews' humanity cannot be tolerated. No one should want universities that cannot manage to uphold the most basic values of a civilized society educating their children. Pakistan carries out a mass expulsion. You're reading an excerpt from the Today's Worldview newsletter. Sign up to get the rest free, including news from around the globe and interesting ideas and opinions to know, sent to your inbox every weekday. As global attention centered on Gaza and the compounding upheavals and traumas triggered by Israel's war on Hamas, another population is in crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Afghan refugees are being forced to leave Pakistan as the country implements an order from its interim government to remove undocumented people from within its borders. Of the roughly 4 million Afghans living in Pakistan, about 1.7 million people are thought to be in the crosshairs of this repatriation plan. The Pakistani government set a November 1 deadline for when people without legal documents, primarily Afghans, but also potentially asylum seekers from persecuted groups such as China's Uyghurs and Myanmar's Rohingya, to remain in the country must leave, or otherwise face arrest and deportation. A network of holding centers for detained migrants has been set up in Pakistan's provinces, and locals report a surge in police harassment and abuse of Afghans living in the country. Close to 200,000 Afghan refugees have already returned to a homeland some do not even know, with the numbers rising. Sarfraz Bugti, Pakistan's caretaker interior minister, has framed the decision as one shaped by security imperatives, claiming that 14 out of 24 major terrorist attacks carried out this year within Pakistan have been by Afghan nationals. Pakistan is struggling to rein in the Pakistani Taliban outfits operating within the country. These factions have loose connections to the Taliban government next door in Afghanistan, which has denounced Pakistan's planned expulsion of its nationals. Many of the Afghans who have joined this exodus were born in Pakistan or fled to the country decades ago as children. I was born in Pakistan, I've lived here for 42 years, I went to school in Pakistan, a man identified as Naseem, who had traveled to the Torkham border, crossing from the northern city Peshawar, told CNN. I've never been to Afghanistan. Now, their lives are subsumed in uncertainty and fear. More than 50 years of chaos and strife in Afghanistan have sent waves of refugees to neighboring Pakistan and Iran. The latest flow came after the Taliban's 2021 takeover in Kabul, but many Afghans have resided in Pakistan since the days of the Soviet invasion. Reporters at border crossings detail tragic stories of Afghan families fleeing police extortion, vigilante violence, and losing their businesses and property. Pakistan's announced deadline for Afghans to return has led to detentions, beatings, and extortion, leaving thousands of Afghans in fear over their future, Fareshta Abbasi, Afghanistan researcher at Human Rights Watch, said in a statement last week. The situation in Afghanistan remains dangerous for many who fled, and deportation will expose them to significant security risks, including threats to their lives and well-being. According to the United Nations, 1.3 million Afghans are registered refugees in Pakistan and 880,000 more have legal status to remain. But a huge population of undocumented Afghans live in the country and are now being collectively punished for the actions of a handful of militants. The large majority of such people are vulnerable Afghan refugees and stateless persons for whom Pakistan has been home for several generations, wrote the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan last month in the wake of the government's order. It is unacceptable to hold them to account for the wrongs of a select few, it added. They have a moral right to seek refuge in this country and to be treated with dignity and empathy. Western governments and international agencies also expressed alarm, warning of a new humanitarian crisis in a country like Afghanistan that is already crippled by a collapsed economy and the pariah status of its political leadership. Some returning refugees face persecution at the hands of the Taliban authorities. Others lament the inability to enroll their girls in schools, given the draconian edicts of the extremists in charge in Kabul. Many fear homelessness and destitution. I lived in Pakistan for more than a decade, a man identified as Momin told Al Jazeera at a border crossing. I have 3 children and a large, extended family, who are being pushed back after the government did not fulfill its promise of providing us proper documentation. I have no money, no roof. Where do I go back to? Unmoved, Pakistan's caretaker government, guided by the country's domineering military, is pressing ahead as it also prepares for elections scheduled February 8. The military, which exerts heavy influence over the caretaker regime, is likely driving the policy. The army chief publicly endorsed the move and attended the meeting finalizing the plan, noted Michael Kugelman, South Asia director at the Wilson Center. But it's letting the caretaker regime, which need not worry about political blowback, take any public flack. Kugelman, writing in Foreign Policy, added that Pakistan may be trying to use the situation in its wrangling with Kabul. Islamabad may be using the expulsion policy in part to compel the Taliban, which have condemned the move, to help more on counterterrorism. Sadly, vulnerable Afghans, from young new arrivals to older and established residents who embrace Pakistan as their only home, are becoming casualties of broader geopolitical machinations. Pakistan has a long, fraught history with the Taliban. The Islamist extremist organization received direct support and succor from Pakistan's military establishment, and various wings of its leadership were allowed sanctuary in Pakistani cities. For years, the US-backed government in Kabul blamed Pakistan for helping incubate the Taliban and enabling its militancy. The tables have somewhat turned now, with Pakistani authorities frustrated with the inability of the Taliban in Kabul to check the infiltration and plots of the Pakistani Taliban. Those include separate attacks over the weekend on a police convoy and at an Air Force base. The attacks have occurred as Pakistan carries out its repatriation plan for Afghans, which has been met with anger in Kabul, noted a Sunday editorial in Pakistani Daily Dawn. Our security apparatus will need to remain extra vigilant and flush out not just the militants, but also their facilitators. In a video statement, the Taliban's acting Prime Minister Mohammad Hassan Khan said that if the current military and civilian rulers of Pakistan, or specifically the generals, have any problems with the Afghan government, they should solve them through negotiations. Come and talk face to face with us, don't mistreat refugees for that. Mullah Muhammad Yaqub, the Taliban regime's defense minister, called on Pakistani officials not to treat Afghan refugees with cruelty and to protect their property and possessions. He issued an ominous warning to Islamabad, as you sow, so shall you reap. Stories from the dark underbelly of Australia's long-term refugee prisons. Melbourne, Australia, Rita Arrow-Rubin put in a video call to her son, Dixtan. Today, they were making kesri, a sweet, spicy semolina dish. For a moment, they forgot their situation, a mom on the outside. A son locked up by the country he chose as his refuge. Arrow-Rubin's face glowed as she described the recipe, putting on a brave face although inside she was aching. Dixtan, now 26, held up the saucepan to show her the finished dish. Yummy, he declared. That September afternoon marked 12 years since Arrow-Rubin arrived in Australia, fleeing persecution on a crowded boat. And 4 years since Dixtan was put in immigration detention here. After the call ended, she lay on her bed staring at his picture on her phone. It is like having a plate of your favorite food in front of you and being told you can't eat it, she said. Each week she drives an hour across Melbourne for a brief, supervised visit. Australia has one of the strictest regimes for undocumented migrants in the world. The Operation Sovereign Borders program, which recorded its 10-year anniversary in September, has been cited as the inspiration for British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's plan to stop the boats crossing the English Channel in search of a better life. Similar conversations are happening across Europe. In Italy, the far-right government is increasing powers to detain and deport migrants. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has vowed to continue the military-led operation that turns back boats attempting to travel here. In a video posted on a government website in August, Navy Commander Rear Admiral Justin Jones implored people not to attempt the perilous boat journey. You are wasting your time, your money, and ultimately your life, he said. Australia's migration laws allow the government to indefinitely detain a non-citizen who does not hold a visa, including those who lawyers say have legitimate claims of asylum. Housing a person in immigration detention costs upward of $250,000 a year. But the cost of appearing soft on border control has helped topple governments here, and the hardline system is rarely questioned, even when it catches out people who thought they were Australian. More than 1,000 people are in immigration detention and 127 have been detained for 5 or more years, a group whose ranks Dixtan will soon join. The average stay is 709 days, and the longest held has been there 16 years, according to official figures. Many are afraid to speak for fear of jeopardizing their cases. But several agreed to share their stories with the Post, providing a rare glimpse of life behind the barriers. A shocking decision. In 2009, Arrow-Rubin's husband was killed when Sri Lankan forces shelled a market where he was buying groceries. She learned after his death that he had been providing intelligence to the Tamil Tigers, a guerrilla group that fought for an independent state in northeast Sri Lanka during a 26-year civil war that ended with their defeat that year. When Sri Lankan soldiers came to question her, she was sexually assaulted, she said, as Dixtan cowered in the next room. She fled the country, leaving Dixtan, then 15, with his grandmother. She did not know where the boat was taking her. She just needed to escape. Arrow-Rubin planned for Dixtan to follow as soon as it was safe. But it didn't work out that way. In 2013, the government made it effectively impossible for boat arrivals to bring their families here, relegating visa applications to the bottom of a backlogged immigration system where they stood little chance of ever being processed. Dixtan and his grandmother were frequently harassed by officials demanding to know his mother's whereabouts. When his grandmother died, life became even more challenging. In 2019, Dixtan flew to Sydney on a fake passport provided to him by a migration agent. The first his mother learned of his plans was when she received a call from border officials who detained Dixtan at the airport. In June, just days after Arrow Rubin, now 55, was granted a visa allowing her to stay in Australia permanently, Dixtan was given a deportation notice. One of the darkest chapters in Australia's history. Policing Australia's vast ocean borders has long been a hot-button political issue here, akin to debate over migrant crossings of the southern U.S. frontier. In 2012, Australia hardened its defences amid a growing exodus from places such as Myanmar and Afghanistan, reopening offshore detention centres on remote Pacific islands where undocumented migrants were housed while their asylum claims were processed. The policy provided the inspiration for the UK plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda, the legality of which is being tested in court. What is not widely known is that many of the world's vulnerable people are locked away in plain sight, in repurposed hotels and immigration facilities in major cities, like Dixtan in Melbourne, as well as behind razor wire fences in the outback. The detention of tennis star Novak Djokovic for breaching coronavirus restrictions brought Melbourne's Park Hotel briefly into the spotlight. Conditions inside have progressively worsened, making them factories for mental illness, according to medical experts. There are so many places in Australia you can hide people, said Pamela Kerr, a longtime refugee advocate. We're supposed to be this easy laid-back country where everything is hunky-dory. There's a dark underbelly. Unlike the United States and most liberal democracies, Australia has no Bill of Rights guaranteeing liberty and the right to be treated with humanity. Successive efforts to fight the incarceration of immigrants in federal court have been thwarted, with brief legal victories capped by new legislation, or, on several occasions, challenges settled out of court when it looked as if the government might lose, according to lawyers. A new challenge will test the legality of indefinitely detaining refugees in the High Court this month. This is genuinely one of the darkest chapters in Australia's history, said Nick McKim, an Australian Greens lawmaker. We need to hold people to account. We need to make reparations to people. And we need to make sure it never happens again. From one prison to another. Like Arrow Rubin, Ju.dy, who goes by one name according to Bangladeshi tradition, had no favored destination in mind when he paid a people smuggler to ferry him to safety in 2012. He had just spent 9 years in a Bangladeshi prison for a murder he didn't commit. The charge was pinned on him in an apparent retaliation for an episode years earlier when he defended his sister against an acid attack by local thugs. When he was eventually pardoned and released, he was forced into hiding. I could not show my face in the area, he said. His boat was intercepted by Australian authorities, and Ju.dy was placed in immigration detention, where he earned the nickname The Master because of his chess skills. At night, he sang, recording Bollywood hits and Bangladeshi songs on the karaoke app StarMaker. 10 years and 1 day later, Ju.dy was released. He was 46 and had spent more than a third of his life locked up. An official letter, viewed by the Post, said he was permitted to remain only until his visa expired in May this year. Ju.dy got a job welding parts for the mining industry. He got his driver's license and bought a car. But 4 months after his visa expired, he received a call asking him to come into the city for an appointment. I'm very scared to meet immigration, but I must go, Ju.dy said over a lunch of fried chicken and rice in mid-September. He called later that day, his voice shaky. He was skipping work that evening, he said. In his anxious state he didn't think he could operate dangerous equipment. His original plan had been to find a place to settle and sponsor his family to join him. But while he's in immigration limbo, reuniting with his family, a son, and a daughter he has never met as his wife was 8 months pregnant when he fled, remains impossible. Alison Battison, a human rights lawyer, said Ju.dy's asylum claim is strong. She suspects his release, along with a handful of other long-term detainees, is a tactic designed to prod them to return to places where their lives are at risk. Detention didn't work. So they're trying something else, she said. When the former corporate lawyer started acting pro bono for refugees, it was rare to find people who had been detained for more than 5 years. Now, 8 years is a starting point for Battison getting involved in a case. Detention really has been incredibly normalized, And it's very worrying that the UK and others are trying to follow this philosophy, Battison said. It's a race to the bottom. Broken boy soldier. Battison said many people have been caught out by the word permanent in their visas, unaware they could be cancelled under laws tightened to make it easier to deport migrants on character grounds. Like William Yekrop. On bad days, Yekrop has flashbacks to the day his father, a soldier in the South Sudanese Civil War, was killed in front of him. He was 5 years old. Yekrop was taken to a rebel camp to be trained as a child soldier. Eventually, he made it out, with his mom and siblings, to a refugee camp in Egypt. At 16, he was granted asylum in Australia. But without any counseling to help deal with his childhood trauma, he turned to alcohol and drugs. That led to bouts of jail time, the longest 13 months. In 2014, Australia cancelled his visa and Yekrop was taken into immigration detention. A refugee tribunal that year found he had a well-founded fear of persecution in South Sudan. The tribunal has the power to review some visa decisions, but it is the country's immigration minister who gets the final say, and a system advocates say gives them godlike powers. Yekrop left South Sudan before the war-torn country became independent and has been told by officials there that he has little prospect of regaining citizenship. The decision to cancel his visa leaves him effectively stateless and in limbo, like the others. His family, including a 14-year-old daughter, live here. But that doesn't stop Australian officials from routinely asking him if he wants to go back to North Africa. In prison, Yekrop undertook drug and alcohol counseling. He cleaned up his act. He worked in the prison kitchen. In immigration detention on Christmas Island, a remote Australian outpost in the Indian Ocean, he was locked up 22 hours a day, surrounded by razor wire fences bordered by jungle. In September, authorities flew him in handcuffs to Yongah Hill Immigration Detention Centre in the Western Australian wheat belt. Yekrop's only escape from the outback haze is exercise. Approaching 40 with the figure of a young man, Yekrop wakes at 6 a.m. for cardio and deadlifts, and runs boot camps. I've been locked up for 10.5 years now. If not for the exercise, maybe I'd give up long ago. The Mississippi governor's race hasn't been this competitive in 20 years. Pascagoula, Mississippi, voters in this deep red state haven't elected a Democrat to the governor's office in more than 20 years, but party leaders and voters are hopeful about their prospects this year, thanks to a tarnished incumbent and their celebrity-related challenger. Brandon Presley, a former small-town mayor and state utilities regulator, has run a surprisingly strong campaign against Republican Governor Tate Reeves, who is seeking a second term. Presley also happens to be a cousin of Elvis Presley. But that's not what has Democrats excited as they prepare to head to the polls on Tuesday. Presley, 46, has focused his campaign on championing populist issues and battling corruption. Reeves, 49, has found himself on the defensive, tangled up in the state's largest public corruption investigation over misuse of millions of dollars in welfare funds while he was lieutenant governor. Reeves is still favored to win. Republicans hold all of the top statewide offices and control both chambers of the legislature, but strategists and grassroots activists on both sides say activity on the ground suggests a close race. A Magnolia Tribune/Mason-Dixon poll in early October had Reeves leading by 8 points. Some more recent private polls have suggested the race has tightened, and during the past month the Cook Political Report shifted it from likely to lean Republican. If neither candidate tops 50%, the contest would go to a runoff 3 weeks later. Jackie Davis is so inspired to see a Democrat running a competitive campaign for governor, he rode his motorized wheelchair around this Gulf Coast port city last week, distributing voting information to neighbors who work in nearby shipyards. He's approachable, cares about people less fortunate. This is going to be a close race, said Davis, 61, who met Presley recently at a local union hall. Presley might benefit from name recognition because of his famous second cousin, a native of Tupelo, Mississippi, but he hasn't made Elvis a focus of his campaign. Instead, Presley, who describes himself as an anti-abortion, pro-gun Christian, has promised to expand Medicaid, cut the state's 7% grocery tax, the highest in the nation, and prevent hospital closures, issues that resonate in struggling communities. He has also hammered Reeves over the issue of public corruption. During the campaign's sole televised debate Wednesday, Presley accused the governor of being bought and paid for. He said the enthusiasm he sees is fueled in part by Reeves's record. "Tate Reeves is the best turnout machine I have," Presley said during an interview after a stop at a Christian bookstore in Biloxi last Sunday. Reeves, in an interview with the Washington Post last week, rejected allegations that he is corrupt, saying the scandal predated his election as governor in 2019. Reeves was lieutenant governor from 2012 to 2020 and before that the state treasurer. The scandal became public in 2020 when the state auditor announced that $77 million in federal welfare money had been mishandled between 2017 and 2020, including millions that went to speaking fees and a pet project for former NFL quarterback and Mississippi native Brett Favre, who has denied wrongdoing. 7 people have since pleaded guilty to bribery, conspiracy, and fraud charges, including the former director of the State Department of Human Services, who was sentenced to 90 years in prison. Reeves has not been charged. The federal investigation is ongoing. Reeves said Medicaid expansion would be a mistake and noted that he has proposed an alternate plan to aid the state's beleaguered hospitals. The governor also has touted his endorsement last week by Donald Trump, and said Presley is being funded by coastal elites. He urged supporters to turn out to vote in defense of the state's conservative policies. "I'm not taking it for granted," he said of his re-election. National Democrats have kept an eye on the Mississippi race over the last year, sensing a strong Democratic candidate could pose a formidable challenge given that Reeves won his 2019 race by only 5 points. Once Presley won the nomination, the party made its first investment this summer. In total, the Democratic Governors Association has spent $5 million, more than twice what it spent on the Democrat who ran for governor in 2019. Democrats acknowledge Presley is a long shot, but they are hopeful he can force Reeves into a runoff. If he does, the party will be looking to replicate their success in Georgia, where Democratic candidates have increased their margins of victory in recent runoffs. In Mississippi, we have a combination of an unpopular incumbent who is scandal-ridden, a great nominee in Brandon Presley who is focused on delivering real change by cutting taxes for working people, ending corruption and expanding Medicaid, said Sam Newton, communications director of the DGA. "We think there's a real chance for an upset." Presley believes black voters are key to winning. He has campaigned at black churches, businesses, and college tailgates. He met with actor and Mississippi native Morgan Freeman in the Delta last month and also campaigned there with Representative Benny G. Thompson over the summer. Black voters make up 37% of Mississippi's electorate, according to the Census Bureau, more than any other state, and they could play a major role in deciding the governor's race, if they turn out. At a minimum, Presley needs 32% of black voters to show up, according to the Cook Political Report. In 2008 and 2012, when Barack Obama was on the ballot, black turnout in Mississippi was only 34% and 35%, respectively. In the 2018, black turnout was 35% for a special election for U.S. Senate featuring Democrat Mike Espy, a former congressman and the first African American to serve as U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, and Republican Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith, who had been appointed to fill a vacancy. The race went to a runoff, which Hyde-Smith won. National organizers from groups like Black Voters Matter say they have spent years laying the groundwork to mobilize black voters, as they did in Georgia before Senator Raphael G. Warnock was first elected in 2021. From the Gulf Coast to the Delta, they say they've been surprised to find local volunteers already doing the kind of repeated, personal outreach that boosts turnout by getting infrequent voters to the polls. "It caught me off guard," said Pamela Shaw, a Jackson-based political strategist who saw far more outreach than she had expected when she toured 7 cities statewide earlier this month with a nonpartisan Get Out the Vote campaign. Black elected officials are rallying around Presley. People are on the ground doing the work who are unrelated to the campaign. National and state organizations are doing work in the communities in ways I haven't seen before. While last week's debate raised awareness about the governor's race among active voters, Shaw said, voter outreach groups have got to talk to the other people who are not engaged and may not even know there's an election. Local nonpartisan organizers with the Poor People's Campaign, a national group fighting racism and poverty based on the work of Martin Luther King Jr., went door-to-door Tuesday in the Delta town of Leland, population 4,000, where 23% live below the poverty line. At low-income housing complexes and trailer parks, they alerted black and white voters to what's at stake in the election. "Just remember to get out and exercise your right," Calvin Stewart told voters as he knocked on doors at Deer Creek Apartments next to a cotton field. Resident Tabitha White, 39, a disabled stay-at-home mom, brought her 12-year-old son to help Stewart. White said she'd already alerted several neighbors who voted absentee. Even though news of the election has been flooding television, some potential voters were still unaware. "Is it Thursday?" said Jakayla Young, 20. Stewart gave her flyers, explained when the election is, and told her that she could vote early. A certified nursing assistant, Young checked a calendar on her phone, said she was off on Tuesday and would try to vote then. She was registered but couldn't recall when she had last voted. Stewart, who leads the campaign's state chapter, said they were targeting just such infrequent, low-income voters in 21 of the state's 82 counties. The biggest obstacle he's faced among both black and white voters: apathy fueled by disillusionment. "They feel whoever you put in there, they're not going to change much," he said. "When elected officials have failed you for so long, you give up." That's what James Sykes, 59, who is white and identifies as Republican, told Stewart later that day as he canvassed a local trailer park. "When it comes around election time, people want your vote. Then they're gone," said Sykes, an oil company trucker, who was doing yard work. "I don't feel like I'm getting represented." He told Stewart that he is undecided on the governor's race. Leah Wright, 56, a public school bus driver, came to see Presley speak in Biloxi last week wearing bifocals that were twisted and missing an arm. Wright said she hasn't been to the eye doctor in 5 years because her deductible is $1,800. Even with a government job and private health insurance, Wright can't find a primary care doctor or get more than 3 of her adult daughter's 13 prescriptions filled. She crosses the border to New Orleans, she said, where due to Medicaid expansion doctors are willing to treat her and pharmacies provide her daughter's medications. "Without Medicaid expansion," she said, "those of us without good insurance, we're doomed." Last weekend, Presley visited Pike County Democrats in Macomb, a town of 12,000 near the Louisiana border where civil rights activists were attacked while battling KKK voter intimidation in the 1960s. Presley connected with the black crowd of about 50 by dwelling on his upbringing, how he was raised by a single mother who worked in a garment factory, struggled to pay the bills, and had their water cut off after his father was murdered when he was 8 years old. "The fight in politics in Mississippi is not right versus left, and sometimes it's not even Democrat versus Republican. It's those of us on the outside versus those of them on the inside," he said to murmurs of, "That's right." Alicia Forrest said Presley's appeal on class lines made her feel a little emotional. "I've been to a lot of debates and heard a lot of people, but Brandon Presley touched me tonight," said Forrest, 64, recalling how when she was a child, her family had their utilities cut off, too. Presley doesn't reference his famous cousin during stump speeches, and while some in the crowds joke about Elvis, their questions for the candidate are about where he stands on the issues. Reverend Devante Johnson, 27, said he has been reaching out to voters in his congregation, door knocking in Macomb and surrounding Pike County. At a local housing project, he found residents of various ages fired up about how Reeves responded during the pandemic, refusing mask mandates and lockdowns, and how he has criticized Black Democrats' management of the capital city, Jackson. He acknowledged that voters in the small railroad city of about 12,000 don't know much about Presley, but they're going to vote against Tate Reeves. Reeves, a financial analyst whose father founded a multi-million-dollar heating and air conditioning company, grew up in the conservative Jackson suburbs. He has supported Trump, including efforts to overturn the 2020 election, and refused to acknowledge that President Biden was lawfully elected. He's counting on turning out his and Trump's conservative base to win, particularly in the Jackson suburbs. Jackson itself is blue, with a population of about 145,000 that's more than 80% black, according to the census. But its metro area is much larger, about 580,000, the biggest in the state of about 3 million. Many live in the conservative suburbs where Reeves grew up, including Madison County, where he won 72% of the vote in 2019. Home to about 111,000 residents, Madison is 57% white, 38% black, 3% Asian, according to the census, About 12% of the county's residents live below the poverty line. On Wednesday, Reese visited Madison to address a crowd of 235 at the monthly Grip and Grin at Mama Hamil's Southern Soul Food sponsored by Madison County Real Republicans. Some in the crowd were worried about moderate friends who said they were voting for Presley due to his stance on hospitals and Medicaid expansion. Others worried about Republican turnout. Reese warned the crowd not to be complacent. The radical left has decided they want to come in and buy the governor's mansion, he said to Applause. He urged his audience to not just vote, but to also contact fellow conservatives. If our people go vote, we are going to have an overwhelming victory, he said, and if not, it could be a close race. Tyler Pager, Scott Clement and Emily Guskin in Washington contributed to this report. In Israeli-Palestinian battle to sway Congress, only one side wins. Pro-Israel is a uniquely bipartisan sentiment on Capitol Hill, a reflection of a powerful lobby and an imbalance of exposure to Palestinians. The congressman was more sympathetic, more supportive of Israel than either lobbyist had expected. He affirmed every point they made, that Hamas is the personification of evil, that the release of hostages must be prioritized, and that the United States must not be distracted by rising Palestinian civilian casualties. You can count on Congress to be a friend, Representative Richie Torres, a 35-year-old Democrat from the Bronx, told his guests. You can count on me to be a friend. Donna Raz-Levy had flown from Tel Aviv to Washington to petition lawmakers on behalf of the more than 200 people who remain captives in Gaza. It was a mission with urgency, and she was pleased by Torres's commitment. That's exactly it, she responded. You understood everything. As the United States has rushed to aid its closest Middle East ally in the aftermath of last month's horrifying cross-border attack by Hamas, many American lawmakers have been swept up in a rhetorical feud over the violence, as Israel's ferocious reprisal drives the Palestinian death toll higher by the day. The capital itself has become a front in this battle of narratives, with protesters, their hands painted red to symbolize the bloodshed, disrupting proceedings to demand a ceasefire now. But in Congress, only one side holds majority sway among those who control the funding of American foreign policy. We have been so grateful for the United States of America, for choosing to be on the right side of history, Levy told Torres as she slid him a few papers bearing the faces of Israeli children and elderly people being held captive. But, she added, there's more that can be done. The Hamas assault on October 7 left bodies and wreckage strewn across southern Israel, where authorities say 1,400 were killed. In the weeks since, more than 6 times as many Palestinians have perished, including thousands of children, amid the unyielding bombardment of Gaza, according to the United Nations Children's Organization and Gaza health officials. That Israel is winning on Capitol Hill, even as a few dozen progressive Democrats in the House and Senate have grown more vocal in their calls for humanitarian relief for Palestinian civilians, is a reflection, to Israel's staunchest proponents, of the Jewish state's moral high ground. Hamas is a terrorist organization, period. The idea that Israel is an oppressor is a joke, Representative Michael Lawler, Republican, New York, said last month in a floor speech. There is no moral equivalency here. It is also a reflection of the decades-long influence of a powerful lobby, and an imbalance of exposure, as lawmakers, many of whom are not experts in international affairs, consider information and forge policy, other lawmakers and analysts said. Stephen Walt, a professor of international affairs and foreign policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, said that while the Israel lobby has been active and influential for decades, there is nothing comparable on the other side. There are no Palestinian American organizations of equal clout, of equal size, he said. Pro-Israel lobbyist groups and individuals contributed nearly $31 million to American congressional candidates during last year's election cycle, more than 6 times the contributions candidates received from the gun rights lobby, according to Open Secrets, a Washington nonprofit that tracks campaign finance and lobbying data. Torres, among the top 20 recipients in the House and Senate, received well over $250,000 from pro-Israel lobbyists during that election. His single biggest donor was the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, the Open Secrets data shows. AIPAC's website says that 98% of candidates it backed won their elections, and that it helped defeat 13 candidates who would have undermined the U.S.-Israel relationship. In the last cycle, AIPAC backed 365 candidates across the political spectrum, ranging from members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus who have called for universal health care and higher taxes to Republican Freedom Caucus members who refused to certify the 2020 election and want to ban the victims of rape and incest from obtaining abortions. What they have in common is Israel. We support pro-Israel candidates running against anti-Israel candidates, AIPAC explains on its website. Levy's associate, Erwin Koteler, a retired Canadian politician and prominent Israel advocate, explained to Torres during their meeting that he was concerned about competing narratives about the conflict. We already see these allegations, he said, that it's Israel that's committing mass atrocities, etc., etc. As Levy and Koteler visited congressional offices, joined by Noam Perry, the daughter of 79-year-old Haim Perry, held hostage by Hamas, pro-Palestinian activists were making their own push but finding few pledges of support. There's a strong position in many offices that Hamas needs to be rooted out and that, while the loss of civilian life is tragic, there's a larger goal at hand, said Robert McCaw, Director of Government Affairs for the Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR, which advocates for Muslims. In the weeks since the start of the war, at least 18 senators and 4 House members have made trips to Israel to meet with Israeli government officials and express their unwavering support for the Jewish state. Many also visited with leaders from other regional allies, such as Egypt and Saudi Arabia. The former is party to a long-standing peace treaty with Israel, and the latter, the potential party to a future treaty, and both of whose influence U.S. officials believe is essential to suppressing the threat of a larger regional war. Lawmakers met with Israeli military officers and with members of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's war cabinet, who showed them a short video montage of the atrocities Hamas had committed. It shaped my understanding of just the level of the depravity and violence, and just total disregard for human life, Senator Mark Kelly, Democrat, Arizona, said later in an interview. The Israeli government, seeking to counter criticism of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, also has shown a longer version of the video to journalists in Washington, New York and Tel Aviv, urging reporters, as well as policymakers, to see Hamas as something akin to the Islamic State terrorist group, or worse. After being shown the video on his trip to Israel, Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat, Connecticut, recalled that one of Netanyahu's ministers said, "These families tried to run and hide. For all of our history, the Jewish people have tried to run and hide. Israel is the place we were supposed to be safe." That moment, Blumenthal said later in an interview, crystallized for many of the delegation how existential this threat is. Hamas has the sole paramount goal to destroy Israel and eradicate the Jewish people. It is simply genocide. None of the delegations, thus far, have met with or spoken to Palestinian authorities during their trips, lawmakers said. "I have talked to Palestinians over the years, and we've had communications with them," Blumenthal added. Senator Ben Cardin, Democrat, Maryland, who chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said that in the month since the attack, he has spoken to Palestinians that I have had prior relations with. There is no issue on Capitol Hill that unites Republicans and Democrats quite like Israel does, members of both parties say. And the halls of the congressional office buildings, studded with "I Stand with Israel" signs and flags, are a testament to that unifying sentiment. The House and Senate both voted overwhelmingly to pass resolutions in support of Israel as it defends itself against Hamas. The Biden administration has asked Congress to approve $14 billion in emergency military assistance for Israel, 4 times Washington's annual budget for the Jewish state. The amount has met little pushback. Lawmakers instead are divided about whether to approve President Biden's request that the package also include money for the war in Ukraine. Publicly voicing support for the Palestinians has proved risky, however. A third of the nearly 20 pro-Israel resolutions and bills proposed by lawmakers in the weeks since Hamas's attack have focused on condemning Israel's critics, including protesters and university students. One House resolution condemned an activist group for rallying in New York City in solidarity with the Palestinian people and their right to resist 75 years of occupation and apartheid. 2 measures have sought unsuccessfully to censure Representative Rashida Tlaib, Democrat, Michigan, the only Palestinian American member of Congress. Representative Ryan Zinke, Republican, Montana, last week introduced a bill that would bar Palestinians from entering the United States and deport others who are already here. AIPAC, the powerful pro-Israel lobby, branded Representative Cori Bush, Democrat, Missouri, as someone who doesn't care about protecting Israeli civilians, after she, backed by 17 colleagues, introduced a resolution calling for a ceasefire. A few dozen other Democrats in the House and Senate have in the past week called for a pause or a temporary ceasefire to allow humanitarian assistance to reach Palestinian civilians, whom the United Nations says are running out of drinking water, food, fuel and basic medicine, since Israel cut off all access to Gaza and launched its air assault. Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat, Connecticut, on Thursday called for Israel to alter its course in the besieged territory, saying the current rate of civilian death inside Gaza is unacceptable and unsustainable. Nearly all of the lawmakers urging humanitarian considerations have included vociferous reiterations of their support for the Jewish state and their abhorrence of Hamas. The average representative or the average senator has very little incentive to go against this consensus or this message of unconditional support for Israel, said Walt, the academic. There's no upside for them. If they express strong support for Israel, they don't get penalized. They don't lose many voters, and they might gain some. If they question U.S. support for Israel, then they're going to face pressure in almost all cases. Some lawmakers and congressional aides said that even meeting with both sides can be fraught. Palestinian advocates have focused their lobbying meetings on pleas for a ceasefire and a lessening of Israel's blockade. Our message is very simple. Turn the electricity and water back on in Gaza. Gaza is running out of time, said Nagi Latifa, a Palestinian-American engineer in Pennsylvania, who met with 4 of his state's lawmakers, in part to plead for relief for his 83-year-old mother, trapped in Gaza, who had contracted a waterborne illness. Days later, she died. Most of the members have no idea what's going on there and don't understand the issue. They just get pushed to vote one way or another, Latifa said. We are so frustrated. We feel betrayed and abandoned by people we helped elect to office. One Palestinian-American couple described their conversation with a Democratic senator who seemed sympathetic but too afraid to say so publicly. The couple said they pushed for a humanitarian corridor to remove the wounded and dead from Gaza. The senator declined to support it. They pushed for drinking water. The senator hesitated, the woman recalled. My husband got heated. He said, Senator, we're asking for water. You can't ask for water? Representative Jamie Raskin, Democrat, Maryland, one of the members who have called for a pause, said he has met with a range of people, including the relatives of Israelis killed by Hamas, and the relatives of Palestinians killed by Israel. I've met with peace activists who are very happy with what I've been doing, and I've met with peace activists who have called me a war criminal, Raskin said. The war has released a lot of raw feelings. I'm trying to think as clearly as I can through this hurricane of grief, fear, blind fury, rage and emotion, which is our daily bread now. Trump trials, Donald Trump takes the stand. The former president is scheduled to testify at his civil fraud trial in New York on Monday. And other trial news. Welcome back to the Trump trials, our weekly effort to keep readers up to date on the criminal and civil cases the 45th president is fighting in federal and state courts. Have questions on the trials? Email us at perry.stein@washpost.com and devlin.barrett@washpost.com and check for answers in future newsletters. Let's get started. What's ahead? Get ready, Trump, the man himself, is expected to take the witness stand on Monday in the civil fraud trial in New York against him and his family real estate business. He is accused of fraudulently inflating his property values to get better terms on loans and insurance. His son Eric said the former president is fired up to testify. It will be interesting to see Trump's demeanor on the stand given how contentious the trial has been thus far. Trump has derided the judge, and the judge imposed a gag order after the former president publicly criticized his law clerk. Ivanka Trump is expected to testify on Wednesday. This may be the only time Trump is on the witness stand over the next year. Yes, he faces 4 criminal trials, but criminal defendants cannot be forced to testify. Now, a recap of what you may have missed last week. 1. Florida, federal classified documents case. The details: Trump faces 40 federal charges over accusations that he kept top-secret government documents at Mar-a-Lago, his home and private club, and thwarted government demands to return them. Planned trial date, May 20th. What happened? At the hearing, Judge Aileen M. Cannon suggested the current schedule for pretrial motions, which would culminate in a trial in May 2024, may be unrealistic because of all the other legal demands on Trump's time, particularly the federal case in Washington. Cannon put her pretrial schedule on hold while she considers issuing an order to push back deadlines. 2. D.C. Federal case on 2020 election. The details, 4 counts related to conspiring to obstruct the 2020 election results. Planned trial date, March 4th. What happened? Judge Tanya S. Chutkan scheduled jury selection to begin on February 9th, with hundreds of D.C. residents to be summoned to the federal courthouse to complete a written questionnaire about the case. This doesn't necessarily mean that the case will start right on time in March. But it strongly suggests that Chutkan aims to move fast and stick to her schedule as much as possible, a contrast to what is playing out so far in the Florida case. A limited gag order issued against Trump by Chutkan, barring him from attacks on the prosecutors, witnesses, and court staffers involved in the D.C. case, is again on hold, at least for now. The federal appeals court in D.C. agreed to pause, or, in legal parlance, stay, the gag order while the court considers whether such restrictions violate his constitutional free speech rights, both as an individual and as a leading presidential candidate. That brings us to our nerd word of the week. The nerd word of the week is stay. Like calling a time out on a particular issue, stays are issued by judges to temporarily halt a ruling or a legal proceeding. The key word here is temporary. Judges may even issue stays of their own rulings, to give the losing side a chance to re-argue or appeal the issue. 3. Georgia, state case on 2020 election. The details, Trump faces 13 state charges for allegedly trying to undo the election results in that state. 18 people were charged alongside Trump, and 4 have pleaded guilty. Planned trial date, none yet. What happened? Lawyers for Harrison Floyd, a co-defendant in the case who worked for the 2020 Trump campaign, appeared in court to argue that their client is entitled to thousands of pages of election records from Fulton County and the Georgia Secretary of State. That's some of the same material that election conspiracists have been seeking for years, and it highlights a novel legal theory that may be presented in court, that the 2020 election was actually stolen. Why it matters, state prosecutors allege that Floyd and other defendants knowingly lied. Floyd's lawyers say they have the right to try to prove that the claims of election fraud weren't a lie at all. 4. New York, state business fraud case. The details, 34 charges connected to a 2016 hush money payment to adult film actress Stormy Daniels. Planned trial date, March 25th. Last week, no significant developments, but at the civil courthouse in New York, there was something of a Trump family reunion. The former president's sons Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump both took the stand and sought to distance themselves from the allegedly fraudulent financial documents. Eric Trump said his role with the Trump Organization focused on construction projects and development deals, not financial documents. Similarly, Trump Jr. deflected blame and said he trusted the company's longtime accounting firm to ensure that all financial documents were accurate. Question time. How did Judge Aileen M. Cannon get assigned to Trump's classified documents case? Should she recuse herself because Trump nominated her to the bench? We're handing this question to our colleague and Marimo, who has reported extensively on Cannon and the judiciary. Cannon first attracted attention when she issued a controversial 2022 decision that slowed the FBI review of documents seized at Mar-a-Lago. She was reversed by a unanimous panel of conservative judges on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. There's been chatter within anti-Trump circles that the process to get Cannon to then oversee the criminal trial was somehow rigged. But that isn't the case. Special counsel Jack Smith made a conscious choice to bring the main classified documents case in South Florida, knowing there was the possibility it would be assigned to Cannon. Court officials said she was randomly assigned as trial judge in June following Trump's indictment. Federal law says a judge shall disqualify herself in any proceeding in which her impartiality might reasonably be questioned. Legal experts say Trump's role in putting Cannon on the bench is not itself a basis for recusal. Federal judges nominated by President Biden, for instance, routinely rule on his administration's policies challenged in court. But a judge could be asked to step aside because of prior rulings that cast doubt on their ability to be impartial. Suggested reads. Trump and allies plan to use Justice Department to seek revenge in a second term. Transformed Trump family takes center stage in a New York courtroom. Trump and the media want a televised trial in D.C. The U.S. doesn't. A Colorado judge considers if Trump incited a riot and if he can run again. An earlier version of this story misstated the scheduled start date of Donald Trump's Florida trial. It is May 20th. Josh Dawsey and Devlin Barrett. Trump and allies plot revenge, Justice Department control in a second term. Advisors have also discussed deploying the military to quell potential unrest on Inauguration Day. Critics have called the ideas under consideration dangerous and unconstitutional. Donald Trump and his allies have begun mapping out specific plans for using the federal government to punish critics and opponents should he win a second term, with the former president naming individuals he wants to investigate or prosecute and his associates drafting plans to potentially invoke the Insurrection Act on his first day in office to allow him to deploy the military against civil demonstrations. In private, Trump has told advisors and friends in recent months that he wants the Justice Department to investigate one-time officials and allies who have become critical of his time in office, including his former chief of staff, John F. Kelly, and former Attorney General William P. Barr, as well as his ex-attorney Ty Cobb and former Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Mark A. Milley, according to people who have talked to him, who, like others, spoke on the condition of anonymity to describe private conversations. Trump has also talked to prosecuting officials at the FBI and Justice Department, a person familiar with the matter said. In public, Trump has vowed to appoint a special prosecutor to go after President Biden and his family. The former president has frequently made corruption accusations against them that are not supported by available evidence. To facilitate Trump's ability to direct Justice Department actions, his associates have been drafting plans to dispense with 50 years of policy and practice intended to shield criminal prosecutions from political considerations. Critics have called such ideas dangerous and unconstitutional. It would resemble a banana republic if people came into office and started going after their opponents willy-nilly, said Sai Krishna Prakash, a constitutional law professor at the University of Virginia who studies executive power. It's hardly something we should aspire to. Much of the planning for a second term has been unofficially outsourced to a partnership of right-wing think tanks in Washington. Dubbed Project 2025, the group is developing a plan to include draft executive orders that would deploy the military domestically under the Insurrection Act, according to a person involved in those conversations and internal communications reviewed by the Washington Post. The law, last updated in 1871, authorizes the president to deploy the military for domestic law enforcement. The proposal was identified in internal discussions as an immediate priority, the communications showed. In the final year of his presidency, some of Trump's supporters urged him to invoke the Insurrection Act to put down unrest after the murder of George Floyd in the summer of 2020, but he never did it. Trump has publicly expressed regret about not deploying more federal force and said he would not hesitate to do so in the future. Trump campaign spokesman Stephen Chung did not answer questions about specific actions under discussion. President Trump is focused on crushing his opponents in the primary election and then going on to beat crooked Joe Biden, Chung said. President Trump has always stood for law and order and protecting the Constitution. The discussions underway reflect Trump's determination to harness the power of the presidency to exact revenge on those who have challenged or criticized him if he returns to the White House. The former president has frequently threatened to take punitive steps against his perceived enemies, arguing that doing so would be justified by the current prosecutions against him. Trump has claimed without evidence that the criminal charges he is facing, a total of 91 across 4 state and federal indictments, were made up to damage him politically. "This is third world country stuff, arrest your opponent," Trump said at a campaign stop in New Hampshire in October. "And that means I can do that, too." Special counsel Jack Smith, Attorney General Merrick Garland and Biden have all said that Smith's prosecution decisions were made independently of the White House, in accordance with department rules on special counsels. Trump, the clear polling leader in the GOP race, has made retribution a central theme of his campaign, seeking to intertwine his own legal defense with a call for payback against perceived slights and offenses to right-wing Americans. He repeatedly tells his supporters that he is being persecuted on their behalf and holds out a 2024 victory as a shared redemption at their enemies' expense. He is going to go after people that have turned on him. It is unclear what alleged crimes or evidence Trump would claim to justify investigating his named targets. Kelly said he would expect Trump to investigate him because since his term as chief of staff ended, he has publicly criticized Trump, including by alleging that he called dead service members suckers. Kelly added, "There is no question in my mind he is going to go after people that have turned on him." Barr, another Trump appointee turned critic, has contradicted the former president's false claims about the 2020 election and called him a very petty individual who will always put his interests ahead of the country's. Asked about Trump's interest in prosecuting him, Barr deadpanned, "I'm quivering in my boots." Trump himself is more likely to rot in jail than anyone on his alleged list, said Cobb, who accused Trump of stifling truth, making threats and bullying weaklings into doing his bidding. Milley did not comment. Other modern presidents since the Watergate scandal, when Richard M. Nixon tried to suppress the FBI's investigation into his campaign spying and sabotage against Democrats, have sought to separate politics from law enforcement. Presidents of both parties have imposed a White House policy restricting communications with prosecutors. An effort under the George W. Bush administration to remove U.S. attorneys for political reasons led to high-level resignations and a criminal investigation. Rod J. Rosenstein, the Trump-appointed Deputy Attorney General who oversaw the investigation by Special Counsel Robert S. Mueller III into Russian interference in the 2016 election, said a politically ordered prosecution would violate the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection under law and could cause judges to dismiss the charges. That constitutional defense has rarely been raised in U.S. history, Rosenstein said. Making prosecutorial decisions in a nonpartisan manner is essential to democracy, Rosenstein said. The White House should not be meddling in individual cases for political reasons. But Trump allies such as Russ Vought, his former budget director who now leads the Center for Renewing America, are actively repudiating the modern tradition of a measure of independence for the Department of Justice, arguing that such independence is not based in law or the Constitution. Vought is in regular contact with Trump and would be expected to hold a major position in a second term. "You don't need a statutory change at all, you need a mindset change," Vought said in an interview. "You need an attorney general and a White House counsel's office that don't view themselves as trying to protect the department from the president. A fixation on prosecuting enemies." As president, Kelly said, Trump would often suggest prosecuting his political enemies, or at least having the FBI investigate them. Kelly said he would not pass along the requests to the Justice Department but would alert the White House counsel's office. Usually, they would ignore the orders, he said, and wait for Trump to move on. In a second term, Trump's aides could respond to such requests differently, he said. "The lesson the former president learned from his first term is don't put guys like me in those jobs," Kelly said. The lesson he learned was to find sycophants. Although aides have worked on plans for some other agencies, Trump has taken a particular interest in the Justice Department. In conversations about a potential second term, Trump has made picking an attorney general his #1 priority, according to a Trump advisor. Given his recent trials and tribulations, one would think he's going to pick up the plan for the Department of Justice before doing some light reading of a 500-page white paper on reforming the EPA, said Matt Mowers, a former Trump White House advisor. Jeffrey Clark, a fellow at Vought's think tank, is leading the work on the Insurrection Act under Project 2025. The Post has reported that Clark is one of 6 unnamed co-conspirators whose actions are described in Trump's indictment in the federal election interference case. Clark was also charged in Fulton County, Georgia, with violating the state anti-racketeering law and attempting to create a false statement, as part of the district attorney's case accusing Trump and co-conspirators of interfering in the 2020 election. Clark has pleaded not guilty. As a Justice Department official after the 2020 election, Clark pressured superiors to investigate non-existent election crimes and to encourage state officials to submit phony certificates to the Electoral College, according to the indictment. In one conversation described in the federal indictment, a deputy White House counsel warned Clark that Trump's refusing to leave office would lead to riots in every major city. Clark responded, according to the indictment, that's why there's an Insurrection Act. Clark had dinner with Trump during a visit to his Bedminster, New Jersey, golf club this summer. He also went to Mar-a-Lago on Wednesday for a screening of a new Dinesh D'Souza movie that uses falsehoods, misleading interviews, and dramatizations to allege federal persecution of January 6 rioters and Christians. Also attending were fringe allies such as Stephen K. Bannon, Roger Stone, Laura Loomer, and Michael Flynn. I think that the supposedly independent DOJ is an illusion, Clark said in an interview. Through a spokeswoman, he did not respond to follow-up questions about his work on the Insurrection Act. Clark's involvement with Project 2025 has alarmed some other conservative lawyers who view him as an unqualified choice to take a senior leadership role at the department, according to a conservative lawyer who spoke on the condition of anonymity to describe private talks. Project 2025 comprises 75 groups in a collaboration organized by the Heritage Foundation. Project 2025 Director Paul Don stood by Clark in a statement. We are grateful for Jeff Clark's willingness to share his insights from having worked at high levels in government during trying times, he said. After online publication of this story, Rob Bluey, a Heritage spokesman, said, there are no plans within Project 2025 related to the Insurrection Act or targeting political enemies. How a second Trump term would differ from the first. There is a heated debate in conservative legal circles about how to interact with Trump as the likely nominee. Many in Trump's circle have disparaged what they view as institutionalist Republican lawyers, particularly those associated with the Federalist Society. Some Trump advisors consider these individuals too soft and accommodating to make the kind of changes within agencies that they want to see happen in a second Trump administration. Trump has told advisors that he is looking for lawyers who are loyal to him to serve in a second term, complaining about his White House counsel's office unwillingness to go along with some of his ideas in his first term or help him in his bid to overturn his 2020 election defeat. In repeated comments to advisors and lawyers around him, Trump has said his biggest regrets were naming Jeff Sessions and Barr as his attorneys general and listening to others. He often cites the Federalist Society, who wanted him to name lawyers with impressive pedigrees and Ivy League credentials to senior Justice Department positions. He has mentioned to several lawyers who have defended him on TV or attacked Biden that they would be a good candidate for Attorney General, according to people familiar with his comments. The overall vision that Trump, his campaign and outside allies are now discussing for a second term would differ from his first in terms of how quickly and forcefully officials would move to execute his orders. Alumni involved in the current planning generally fault a slow start, bureaucratic resistance and litigation for hindering the president's agenda in his first term, and they are determined to avoid those hurdles, if given a second chance, by concentrating more power in the West Wing and selecting appointees who will carry out Trump's demands. Those groups are in discussions with Trump's campaign advisors and occasionally the candidate himself, sometimes circulating policy papers or draft executive orders, according to people familiar with the situation. No one is opposed to them putting together ideas, but it's not us, a campaign advisor said. These groups say they'll have the whole transition planned. Some of those people I'm sure are good and Trump will appoint, but it's not what is on his mind right now. I'm sure he'd be fine with some of their orders. Trump's core group of West Wing advisors for a second term is widely expected to include Stephen Miller, the architect of Trump's hardline immigration policies including family separation, who has gone on to challenge Biden administration policies in court through a conservative organization called America First Legal. Miller did not respond to requests for comment. Alumni have also saved lists of previous appointees who would not be welcome in a second Trump administration, as well as career officers they viewed as uncooperative and would seek to fire based on an executive order to weaken civil service protections. For other appointments, Trump would be able to draw on lineups of personnel prepared by Project 2025. Don, a former Office of Personnel Management Chief of Staff, likened the database to a conservative LinkedIn, allowing applicants to present their resumes on public profiles, while also providing a shared workspace for heritage and partner organizations to vet the candidates and make recommendations. We don't want careerists, we don't want people here who are opportunists, he said. We want conservative warriors. Marianne Levine and Karen DeYoung contributed to this report.